It all started on a typical morning in Cedar Rapids when a downtown street just suddenly gave way. The pavement near the I-380 off-ramp cracked, dipped, and then collapsed outright, leaving behind a jagged hole wide enough to swallow a car. A city maintenance worker on site later said that the event sounded like, quote, a crunch from the underneath. Like the street had exhaled, dust rose into the air, traffic backed up, and bystanders stood around, peering into the void, mostly expecting to see sewer lines or utility conduits, but what they found instead was stranger. You see, when engineers lowered a camera into the cavity, the footage showed bricked walls with barrel-vaulted ceilings. This was a chamber, perfectly arched and built by hand. And it didn't take long for the world to realize that this was a forgotten beer cave. Though it should have been obvious, since beneath the surface of Iowa's second largest city lies a buried world, an industrial labyrinth carved out by 19th century breweries, used to chill thousands of barrels before the invention of the refrigerator. So how did these underground vaults, once essential to Iowa's brewing economy, vanish so completely? And what, if anything, remains today? Stay tuned to find out as we uncover the lost beer caves of Cedar Rapids. I'm your host Ryan Socash, and you're watching It's History. In the mid-1800s, Iowa was booming. Towns were sprouting up along rivers and rail lines, where Cedar Rapids, once a small milling outpost along the Cedar River, quickly became a hub of commerce and transportation. By the 1950s, grain production was also surging, and so was the population, fueled in part by waves of European immigrants. And with every new settlement came the need for something familiar, something cultural, something comforting. Basically, these new arrivals, they needed beer. But brewing in Iowa wasn't just about refreshment, it was about practicality. Basically, drinking water in those times was unreliable due to quality concerns, especially in rapidly growing towns. Hence, beer offered a safer, more stable alternative. It didn't spoil quickly, it traveled well, and it used simple ingredients like grain, hops, and yeast, items which could be produced in abundance locally. But there were still challenges. Remember, at that time, beer didn't come in bottles or cans. Rather, you bought it by the barrel, usually at the source or in a saloon that had it delivered fresh from the local brewer. Which meant freshness mattered, temperature mattered, and that's where things got tricky. You see, before refrigeration, there was only one way to keep beer cold: the ground. The brewing practices that arrived in Iowa mainly came from Germany or Bohemia, and these immigrants brought with them a deep knowledge of lagering, a method of fermenting beer slowly at low temperatures to achieve clarity and shelf life. Back in Europe, beer had been aging in cellars carved into the hillsides or stored in natural caves. Iowa had no mountains, but it did have limestone. With that in mind, these new American brewers of European descent got to work. The first known commercial breweries in Iowa City and Cedar Rapids were built in the 1850s. Some had above-ground ice houses, filled each winter with blocks cut from frozen rivers. Others dug directly into the earth, creating arched cellars that maintained a year-round chill. Hence, these were more than just basements. They were engineered spaces, insulated with bricks and stone, shaped to move air and deep enough to hold a steady temperature, 40 degrees or less. And as demand grew, so did the scale. Remember, the beer wasn't just being brewed for a block or a neighborhood. It was a hydration source for the entire town, meaning the storage had to grow alongside the production. Ice wagons could only do so much, and shallow basements couldn't keep pace with larger batches. Hence, at this point, what the brewers needed was a cold, dark, stable environment. In other words, entrepreneurs were about to build man-made beer caves. By the mid-19th century, brewing had become a significant industry in Iowa's emerging towns, and no towns showcased that fact better than Cedar Rapids and the neighboring Iowa City. Brewers carved out vast subterranean systems as the heart of their breweries, a space just as crucial as the kettles or the tap room. One grand example of this was the Magnus Brewery in Cedar Rapids, built in 1859. At its peak, the complex had 5 underground cellars 2 ice houses and could produce 60 barrels of beer every 12 hours. That's 1,800 gallons in just half a day. Their caves held up to 2,000 barrels at a time, stacked, cooled, and carefully roasted. And although a 5-story building stood above it, the real work took place down below. Not far from there was Iowa City's Union Brewery, founded in 1856, which also had its own sprawling cave system beneath what's now known as Brewery Square. These arched, brick-lined vaults once stretched across 3 subterranean levels. Access was limited to those who could descend a 25-foot shaft, a route that today's archaeologists still call the Ladder of Death. Whereas not far from that was the Old City Brewery, built by German immigrant John Elgert. Though both buildings are long gone, their caves still exist. Buried and largely sealed, a beer tunnel once ran under East Market Street, connecting Brewery Square to a nearby tavern that also served as a hotel. The architecture of these caves was remarkable. Masons, often of German or Welsh descent, used tapered stone to construct arches and vaulted ceilings, a design that not only evenly distributes weight but also creates an environment where temperatures hover near 35 to 40 degrees Fahrenheit year-round. Some caves even featured spring-fed troughs to cool barrels through direct contact with icy runoff. However, we should also note that storing beer was only half of the equation. Once ready, barrels were hoisted up to street level and loaded onto wagons or freight carts, bound for saloons, hotels, and beer gardens throughout the city. But distribution didn't always end there. You see, Cedar Rapids had begun developing its early rail links by the 1860s, and breweries close to those lines, like the Magnus, took full advantage. And for a time, this was the perfect system. Immigrant laborers kept digging, brewmasters filled their cellars to the brim, and Cedar Rapids, along with Iowa City, became known not just for grain, but for what that grain could become. Underground, the air stayed cool, and above it, the beer flowed freely from barrel to ballroom. By the late 1800s, at least 14 major beer caves had been documented beneath Cedar Rapids alone, some stretching hundreds of feet, lined with limestone, brick, and ice-fed troughs. Collectively, they stored thousands of barrels at a time, and it's interesting to consider that this was almost like a shadow economy, operating just beneath the city's feet. But here's the catch. The deeper these breweries rooted themselves into the economy, the more vulnerable they became to what was brewing above ground. New temperance laws, cultural backlash, and a rising national movement to ban alcohol altogether. Prohibition didn't just forbid alcohol, it outlawed an American way of life. And in Iowa, local option laws had already been putting pressure on breweries since the 1880s. However, it was the ratification of the 18th Amendment in 1919, followed by the Volstead Act in 1920, that effectively shut the doors of an entire industry. Just like that, practically overnight, legal brewing came to a halt. In Cedar Rapids, places like the Magnus Brewery, once capable of producing 60 barrels every 12 hours, would be forced to shutter its operations. The company limped along for a few years, pivoting to products like ice and soda, but by 1937, the entire complex was demolished to make way for new housing, and its vast underground storage was forgotten entirely. Ironically, that housing would later be torn down again for the construction of Interstate 380, which would unknowingly pass right over the old beer caves, a fact that, as you might recall from the intro, would end badly. Now, in Iowa City, the Union Brewery managed to survive by converting parts of its operations to dairy and soft drinks, but the beer caves beneath Brewery Square were no longer in use, as the saloons they once supplied closed or were forced underground, figuratively and sometimes literally. And for many of these caves, there was no dramatic moment of sealing, they were just kind of left to be. Some were bricked off, whereas others were filled with rubble to prevent vagrancy or collapse. By the 1940s, most locals were unaware of what was beneath the streets, and that would remain the case for many, many years, until the beer caves started collapsing. For most of the 20th century, the beer caves beneath Cedar Rapids and Iowa City existed only in rumors and fragments. Odd memories passed down over the generations, odd maps and filing cabinets, and the occasional whisper from someone who knew about something like a mysterious hatch in an old basement. But as I trust you recall from the intro chapter, all of that changed in the summer of 2014. It all started after weeks of unusually heavy rainfall when a large sinkhole opened near Interstate 380 in downtown Cedar Rapids. Now, what should have been a straightforward infrastructure issue turned into something else entirely. The sinkhole had punched through a 150-year-old beer cave. That single discovery kicked off a citywide reckoning. Soon after, the Iowa Geological Survey, in collaboration with the Department of Transportation and the Office of the State of Archaeologists, began deploying tools like ground-penetrating radar to survey the downtown subsurface. What they uncovered was stunning. An interconnected system of at least 14 distinct beer caves, some still structurally sound, others partially collapsed, and most completely undocumented up to that point. Among the largest were the remnants of the Magnus Brewery complex, which prior to Prohibition had operated 5 subterranean storage vaults and 2 ice houses. Though the above-ground brewery was demolished in 1937, its underground footprint had survived beneath what later became residential housing. And then, decades later, the highway. Now, these rediscoveries, as interesting as they are, presented a major challenge. On one hand, these caves were historic. They were constructed by European artisans and integral to Iowa's early industrial economy, facts that are deeply tied to the local identity. On the other hand, they posed a real threat to public safety. Roads, sidewalks, and entire structures had unknowingly been built over massive empty chambers. And to be clear, the 2014 collapse was not the first, and officials feared it would not be the last. So the response was swift and, in many ways, final. Between 2014 and 2015, the city began sealing off known caves, filling them with concrete and grout mixtures to stabilize the ground. These were not acts of preservation, they were acts of containment. Though rest assured, not everything was lost. Before the sealing began, researchers managed to perform full 3D scans of several chambers, turning brick-lined tunnels into digital models, preserving their scale and structure in the virtual space. These scans were later used to create fly-through animations and VR walkthroughs, offering the public a unique chance to see spaces that were no longer accessible. Meanwhile, Brewery Square in Iowa City remains the most intact and studied site. Accessible only through a hatch behind pipes in the building's basement, it's still visited by archaeologists, historians, and even the occasional tour group. Now, once inside, you'll find the original barrel hoops scorched by fire, as well as torch holders carved into the wall and that stone trough which once fed spring water used to float barrels at an optimal temperature. Though beyond that, little more than bricked-in arches behind basements and old property records have survived. The beer caves were never meant to last forever, but you can help their stories survive by sharing this video with a friend, and a special thanks to our viewer who submitted the story idea. Otherwise, I thank you for watching, and until next time, this is Ryan Socash, signing off.